how I met Russell and got involved is basically what I'll be talking about in a bit. But I was born and raised in downriver area, 7th grade kids, went to Catholic schools, Catholic seminary, and I got out of school thinking, or went to college, majored in journalism, moving in on graduation time, and I was thinking, I must be pretty smart, or smart enough if I'm going to graduate. And then the second semester of my junior year, I signed up for a class with Russell, and was just absolutely stunned, number one, and what I didn't know, and number two, how I had, I don't want to say been cheated, but how I had been deprived of just a vast store of knowledge. So after my experience with Russell, I got into, or actually during my experience with Russell, I got into the newspaper business and have been a reporter all these years. And lately I'm doing politics and writing and so on. But my talk will be about the life and times of Russell, my life and times with Russell.
Yeah, Jay and I, we're like the Smothers Brothers now. We're like this. Jay and I were talking about how we would, because we're all deferring to Dr. Paffer's brilliance, and so Jay's talking.
I'm being set up.
But Jay and I, you know, we have our finger on the pulse in many ways of the activist community. So we're kind of interested in who you are and why you chose this session. So we're curious, how many of you actually have met Russell Kirk? 2 of you. How many of you have read one of his books? A couple of you. Are there any particular questions or reasons why you came to this session that you really look to have answered today? I mean, what can someone? Yeah, absolutely.
I read The Conservative Mind quite a few years ago. I'm rereading it. This is the kind of stuff we all are going to need to really get a hold of in order for any movement or any changes to last.
You got that right.
Otherwise, we're going to be building straw houses and stick houses like the Three Little Pigs.
Very well.
We need to have something.
The reason I'm here mainly is because up to like I said, my junior year of college, I was probably a typical kid in college. You'll remember the Vietnam was raging. Richard Nixon was president and was utterly hated. Drugs were everywhere. It was just total chaos. And I was in the journalism program. There was an article in Central Michigan Life newspaper that said this national columnist is coming to teach a class called The Conservative Mind. And he had been a columnist for more than 20 years. Well, I was going into journalism and wanted to be a newspaper man, and I was fascinated. A national columnist is going to be here. And somehow I got it in my head that this was going to be James Jackson Kilpatrick. And I thought, why would he be coming out of here from Washington, D.C.? So I'm in the classroom. There were probably less than a dozen of us, and including a girl who would be almost your stereotypical student at that time. She had long hair. I bet she was 20, 21 years old. Bib overalls. It was wintertime, so she couldn't have been in sandals, so she was probably wearing shoes, and a t-shirt, and nothing under the t-shirt. So we're sitting there, and in walks Russell at about, the class started, it was a 3-hour class, went 7 to 10, and in walks Russell, and I will never forget the immediate reaction. He walks in a 3-piece suit. He always wore a 3-piece suit. He's got a big, sort of a biggish tie with this big, I don't want to say gold, a tie clasp on it. That after you remember the tie clasp, I'm sure. And boots. He was wearing boots that went up past the ankle, polished to a bright black shine. And I'm almost certain up to that time I had never seen a professor in a tie before. It was, and he got there and started talking, and this sort of hippie girl sitting right here, who I'd had in other classes in the journalism program, she sort of looked over that way, and then she looked that way, and then she looked at me and said, something like, "God damn, nobody dresses like that." And then she got up and left the class, and we never saw her again. So it was, I mean, the reaction was amazing. I hearkened back to my seminary days when everybody came well-groomed and all that. Then Russell started talking about conservatism, using the word conservative over and over and over again. And I had never, I don't think I had ever heard anybody say anything charitable or kind about somebody who might be conservative, except to say maybe we shouldn't kill Nixon right now, you know, maybe put him in prison, you know, for a lifetime or something. So he had us read The Conservative Mind, which, as you say, is a very dense book, and I read it, but what I remember mainly is the introduction. There was, in addition to all these long words that required me getting a dictionary and looking up conflagration, I remember distinctly. Is that your water?
No, it's not.
Okay, whoever's water this is, I'm going to steal it. So,
Jay, I'll get you one.
oh, okay.
You want to check the medical report?
So as time went on, you know, we're reading all this stuff I had never seen before, and there were constant, continual themes that could be summarized in simple phrases, like he makes references to the unbought grace of life, nothing new under the sun, the littlest platoon, linking generation to generation, and each of these, as John Pafford would know, were topics that Russell could sit in his living room and talk for hours, and just going on and on and on. So as time rolled on, I got more and more fascinated with Russell. He had me write a book about Orestes Bronson, and I said, I'd never heard of this guy before. And I'd never written believe it or not, a 25-page type term paper before. And Russell said, I will bring you some books, I'll bring you some books. So he came back the next day with 13 books from his personal library for me to read, and I thought, who does that? You know, and these were all, many of them were very, very old books. So I started reading this stuff and started getting completely enamored of Russell. Then there was the party at the end of the class where he invited everybody out to Piety Hill. I'd never seen a house like Piety Hill before. It's an old style Italianate house. The main room, they call it a drawing room, would be about almost this deep, would you say?
Well, fairly close.
Almost that deep and almost as wide, 14-foot ceilings, and a grand staircase going up. Now, I grew up in a factory town. I'd never seen anything like that. And Annette, I'd never met anybody like Annette. It was just the most gracious kind of thing we had ever seen. And Russell kept saying, come upon me at Piety Hill. You know, when you have time, come visit us. And then Annette would say that kind of stuff. So over time, I talked to her more and more and more. And then I had an opportunity, after I graduated, I had a job, an opportunity to work in a newspaper in Reed City, which is 30 miles from where Reed City is. So I called around and found out if you know, it would be safe to work in that for that publisher. And it just happened, another newspaper man who had been in this chain of weeklies was Dave Schock, who was a very close friend of the Kirk. So I moved up to Reed City and worked 30 miles away, and Annette took me in as if, like she did so many other people, and you've met hundreds of them, I think. It was, if you think of the image like a stray cat, you know, who's sort of starved, totally ungroomed, very lonely. It was like all of us came here, you know, can you do something with us? And Annette would say, we'll take you in. So I signed up to be a student for Russell for a full year, and I was going to live in the house. And I would have been one of the early, I don't know, early, but this was before the Wilbur Fellows started, before all of that. So I went there, and I was there only 2 days. My dad got sick, and I couldn't stay. Couldn't live there, but I was in regular communication with them from Detroit and came up all the time. As time rolled on, I got to spend just a lot of time with them and got to travel around. And I heard him speak on hundreds of occasions. And it's exactly like John Pafford said. You could sit there and listen for hours, and he would talk without notes, and it was almost as if every talk, not every talk, but every other talk, there was new information you had never heard before. And he would talk about people like Santayana, and you'd go to these scholarly conferences where very, very bright minds would be there, and invariably one or more of them would say, Russell, you always come up with these scholars nobody's heard of before. And I think it is true that he brought Santayana out of nowhere. Am I wrong? He sort of
We revived him some.
revived, and there were several others like that. So the main thing about Russell that was so striking to me is that he truly believed everything he talked about. You know, he never pretended to be a particularly pious person, even though the place was called Piety Hill, but he had the strongest reverence for people of faith and all the rest of it. He was struggling with 3 kids. I don't want to say struggling, but he had 3 children to raise, and the country was in a state of crisis. By the nature of what he traveled all over the country, and this was a Cold War. You'll remember Vietnam had collapsed, and there were boat people. One day, Annette was very active in the community, and she was on the at that time they had what they call welfare boards in the counties. So Annette was one of 3 or 4 people who would decide who got welfare. Well, she was tapped into all these social agencies. So somebody called from Cambodia or Laos and said, we have X number of families who have escaped from Vietnam, and if they are not placed within 24 hours, they will go back and surely killed. Annette got on the phone and called Dave Schock and others, and they placed within 24 hours a bunch of families. Russell and Annette took in a family of 10 Vietnamese. That would be mother, father, and the 10 children, who had all climbed in a boat. They were stereotypical boat people, went out to sea, somehow got rescued. Russell took them in. And imagine the expense of that. Housing, probably medical bills, all the rest of it. In the meantime, Annette was also bringing in unwed children, unwed mothers, who, women who had gotten themselves in a sorry situation, and through one connection or another, they connected with Annette, and they had a large house. Annette's children were small, probably the eldest was about 10. And she was bringing these young women in on a continual basis, and they were a part of their lives. So as time rolled on, Russell expressed that kind of charity, that kind of generosity to just about everybody. And to me, it was breathtaking to see, because and later as a newspaper man, you run into so many people who are not what they say they are. When you read The Enemies of Permanent Things, Politics of Prudence, the book that really drew me in was Confessions of a Bohemian Tory, which I think is out of print. But Russell lived all of these things, the virtues. He had the most profound respect for it, and he was able to pass these eternal verities. He keeps talking about eternal verities. He was able to popularize them and pass them on, so that 35 years later, I'm sitting here, talking to you about these things. And Darren, who never met him, this is a major part of your life now, I think, passing all of this on. So the final thing I just want to say.
Did you ever meet Clinton?
Yeah, I knew Clinton. Yeah, Clinton
was a hobo.
Clinton was a hobo. Yeah, great size 12D shoes. I ran a shoe store, and I would bring shoes up all the time for all these refugees. Russell used to call them refugees, prisoners. He said he had a house full of inmates, refugees.
Clinton is true, because Clinton spent time, he did time for
Clinton was
petty theft primarily, however.
all of yeah. But I just want to end. I have one little sermon I want to say. Number one, as a conservative, you owe it to yourself to really delve into some of Russell's stuff. It is stuff you've never seen before. Number two, one of his favorite authors was P.J. Woodhouse, who happens to be one of yours, I think. And the thing that impressed me is this was one guy with one idea and one plan. Early on, he decided, I am going to push the conservative ideal, all the rest of it. He wrote The Conservative Mind, and the rest of his life was devoted to that. He, as far as I know, he never was involved in any real estate deals, he never did any investing, he never saved any money, because all the money went, imagine, to the Vietnamese, the Cambodians, all the rest of them. And that is a lesson that all of us should recognize, that it doesn't matter what role we are. We don't have to be Russell, we don't have to be intellectuals. What we do, if we stick to the plan, we can have the same kind of effect that Russell had. That's my whole story.